Money does not announce its psychological influence loudly, it seeps quietly into perception, reshaping priorities, altering reactions, and redefining what feels urgent or insignificant over time. Most people believe money simply expands options, yet it also narrows attention, training the mind to evaluate value, efficiency, and return in places once governed by emotion. When resources increase, small inconveniences feel unnecessary rather than tolerable, and patience subtly declines as the mind recalibrates its tolerance for friction and delay. Scarcity teaches endurance and improvisation, while abundance teaches optimization and elimination, producing a cognitive shift few recognize as it unfolds. What once felt meaningful may begin to feel inefficient, and what once felt generous may begin to feel strategically allocated rather than freely expressed. The transformation rarely feels dramatic, because it emerges gradually, through repeated decisions, altered environments, and new reference points for comfort and control. Money changes not only what you can buy, but what you notice, what you ignore, and what you quietly begin to expect from the world. Gratitude may remain, yet it coexists with heightened standards, creating a tension between appreciation and subtle dissatisfaction with anything perceived as suboptimal. Social interactions also shift, as conversations become filtered through unspoken calculations of opportunity cost, alignment, and long-term consequence. Even time begins to feel different, no longer an open landscape but a managed asset, divided, protected, and measured with quiet precision. The mind adapts to reduced uncertainty, and in doing so, it becomes less tolerant of chaos, inefficiency, and emotional unpredictability. Security alters risk perception, sometimes increasing boldness, sometimes deepening caution, depending on what is at stake and who is observing. Comfort reduces certain anxieties while amplifying others, particularly those related to preservation, reputation, and sustained control. Money does not simply provide stability, it introduces new layers of psychological complexity that quietly reshape identity and perception. Over time, thinking patterns become structured around leverage rather than survival, around influence rather than endurance, around control rather than adaptation. At the core of this transformation lies a shift from reactive cognition to strategic cognition, where decisions are filtered through anticipated consequence rather than immediate necessity. Behavioral psychology suggests that scarcity heightens present focus, while abundance expands temporal horizons, allowing the wealthy to think in extended timelines. This temporal expansion alters emotional response, reducing impulsivity in some areas while increasing calculated risk-taking in others. With money comes optionality, and optionality changes perception, because the mind no longer sees single paths but multiple alternatives in every situation. This multiplicity of choice encourages evaluation, comparison, and optimization, creating a habit of mental simulation before action. Where scarcity fosters gratitude for access, abundance fosters scrutiny of quality, shifting attention from obtaining to refining. Loss aversion becomes recalibrated, as protecting accumulated resources can generate heightened sensitivity to potential threats or inefficiencies. Trust becomes selective, not necessarily colder, but more structured, guided by patterns, incentives, and observable reliability. The wealthy often develop a preference for controlled environments, where variables are minimized and outcomes feel influenced rather than random. Cognitive bandwidth increases when financial pressure decreases, allowing deeper planning, yet it also invites overanalysis and constant evaluation. Money reduces certain stresses, but it replaces them with preservation concerns, subtle vigilance, and awareness of visibility. Identity gradually intertwines with financial capability, influencing self-perception, social posture, and internal standards. Behavior becomes shaped by leverage thinking, where effort is assessed in terms of scalability and long-term impact rather than immediate output. Relationships are filtered through alignment, not sentiment alone, as shared values and strategic compatibility gain importance. Emotional expression may become moderated, as stability encourages composure and discourages volatility in high-visibility contexts. Risk tolerance shifts unpredictably, sometimes expanding due to safety nets, sometimes contracting due to fear of losing accumulated position. The wealthy mind often becomes oriented towards systems rather than events, seeking structural control instead of situational reaction. This cognitive restructuring does not feel ideological, it feels practical, yet over time it quietly changes how one interprets fairness, effort, and reward. Money reframes effort as investment, time as capital, and relationships as networks of potential influence. Through repetition, these mental adjustments consolidate into personality traits, subtle yet persistent, shaping perception long after the first increase in wealth. The shift is not inherently moral or immoral. It is adaptive, yet it can distance the individual from earlier emotional frameworks. In this way, money quietly changes the way you think, not by force, but by steadily altering the context in which every decision is made. Consider a man who once compared grocery prices carefully, now walking through the same store selecting items without hesitation, his attention drifting toward quality and convenience rather than cost. He no longer calculates survival, he calculates efficiency, choosing the option that preserves time, even if it quietly increases financial outflow. In meetings, he listens differently, less concerned with immediate approval, more focused on long-term leverage and structural advantage. Where he once sought consensus, he now evaluates competence, filtering opinions through perceived expertise and strategic alignment. A woman who recently expanded her wealth notices invitations feel different. Social gatherings subtly scanned for value, connection, or unnecessary obligation. She leaves earlier than before, not from boredom, but from awareness that attention is finite and must be allocated deliberately. In conversations, she reveals less about personal plans, understanding that information itself carries influence and potential vulnerability. Friends notice her pauses before answering, brief silences that signal evaluation rather than uncertainty. Vacations transform as well, destinations chosen for privacy and restoration rather than novelty or public validation. Comfort becomes standardized, not indulgent but expected, and inconvenience feels less tolerable than it once did. When approached with risky opportunities, wealthy individuals often request data rather than reassurance, preferring structure over emotional persuasion. They ask about downside exposure, contingency planning, and systemic resilience before expressing enthusiasm. Even generosity changes form, becoming organized, strategic, and often anonymous rather than spontaneous and visible. A parent with financial security may encourage calculated independence in children, focusing on competence rather than simple compliance. Daily routines become optimized, assistant hired, processes automated, inefficiencies quietly eliminated without ceremony. Time slots are guarded carefully, conversations shortened, interruptions filtered by layers of protection. In romantic relationships, expectations subtly shift, stability and shared ambition weighted more heavily than chemistry alone. Silence becomes more comfortable, as internal dialogue replaces constant external affirmation. Social media presence may decrease, not from detachment, but from recognition that visibility invites projection and scrutiny. Even humor becomes measured, playful yet restrained, ensuring no unintended consequence disturbs cultivated stability. These patterns accumulate gradually, producing a demeanor that feels composed, selective, and occasionally distant. Beneath these behaviors lies neurocognitive adaptation, where reduced scarcity lowers cortisol responses and permits broader executive functioning. With expanded executive control, the prefrontal cortex dominates decision-making, dampening impulsive emotional reactions driven by survival urgency. This neurological shift increases tolerance for delayed gratification, reinforcing long-horizon planning and strategic patience. However, diminished exposure to constraint can reduce empathy for chaotic environments once familiar. The mind normalizes stability quickly, recalibrating baseline expectations upward, making former hardships feel abstract rather than immediate. Social comparison also intensifies within elite circles, as new reference groups redefine what constitutes success or adequacy. Identity gradually fuses with capability, creating subtle anxiety around loss of status or diminished influence. Control becomes psychologically rewarding, reinforcing behaviors that preserve predictability and minimize uncertainty. The avoidance of randomness is not fear alone. It is reinforcement learning shaped by high-consequence outcomes. Wealth introduces asymmetrical stakes, where small misjudgments can produce amplified reputational or financial ripple effects. As a result, vigilance increases quietly, embedded within everyday cognition rather than expressed as overt worry. Emotional restraint becomes adaptive, since volatility can destabilize networks built on perception and reliability. Trust narrows because incentives around the wealthy often distort authenticity, encouraging guarded social filters. The brain begins pattern recognition around exploitation risk, sometimes accurately, sometimes excessively. Pleasure systems also recalibrate, as access to comfort reduces novelty impact, requiring deeper meaning to evoke satisfaction. This can create a paradox of abundance and restlessness, where material ease coexists with subtle psychological tension. Over time, the wealthy thinker becomes architect rather than participant, preferring to design environments instead of reacting within them. Such architecture of control offers security, yet it may distance spontaneous intimacy and unfiltered connection. Money therefore alters cognition through environment shaping, neurological recalibration, and social incentive restructuring. The change is gradual enough to feel natural, yet profound enough to redraw the internal landscape of perception. In quiet moments, the individual may sense the distance between former simplicity and current complexity, without fully articulating the shift. Money does not announce transformation, it embeds itself into thought patterns until thinking itself feels different, structured, and subtly guarded. There is value in observing these shifts without judgment, and if this kind of measured psychological exploration resonates, you may choose to subscribe and continue examining such patterns over time. Not for affirmation or instruction, but for ongoing reflection on how power, wealth, and environment quietly reorganize the architecture of the mind. Many assume money simply amplifies who you already are, yet it often reshapes perception itself, altering priorities, fears, and definitions of meaning. The belief that wealth guarantees peace ignores the cognitive burden of preservation, visibility, and sustained performance under observation. Some imagine that financial freedom eliminates insecurity, while in reality it can introduce new anxieties around status erosion and irreversible loss. It is often said that money corrupts character, but more accurately it exposes incentives, revealing how context guides moral flexibility and restraint. Another misconception suggests that wealthy individuals think only about accumulation, overlooking that many focus primarily on protection and structural control. People frequently romanticize abundance as endless enjoyment, ignoring the adaptation effect that normalizes comfort and diminishes novelty over time. There is also the illusion that greater resources produce unlimited confidence, when often they produce calibrated caution and strategic silence. Wealth is perceived as social elevation, yet it can produce subtle isolation as shared reference points with earlier environments dissolve gradually. The narrative of effortless luxury conceals the mental modeling, scenario planning, and risk anticipation that shape high-level decision-making. Even the idea that money buys happiness oversimplifies the psychological equation, neglecting how expectations rise in parallel with capability. In truth, money does not simplify human nature, it complicates it, layering new motives over existing desires and reshaping internal dialogue. Over years, the shift becomes less visible externally and more structural internally, embedded within assumptions about control, value, and possibility. The mind that once navigated limitation now navigates leverage, and this difference quietly reorders emotional response patterns. Small frustrations lose intensity, yet subtle threats to stability gain disproportionate psychological weight. Gratitude may remain intact, yet it is accompanied by vigilance, as preservation replaces acquisition as the dominant theme. Conversations feel different because stakes feel different, even when nothing explicit is said. Identity evolves around capability, and capability subtly demands maintenance, attention, and continuous calibration. Money changes how silence feels, how risk is interpreted, and how opportunity is evaluated in quiet internal calculations. It alters the meaning of time, turning hours into strategic assets rather than open intervals of possibility. It influences empathy, sometimes deepening it through distance from survival stress, sometimes narrowing it through abstraction. The transformation rarely feels dramatic to the individual experiencing it, because each adjustment seems reasonable in isolation. Yet when viewed collectively, these adjustments reveal a profound cognitive migration from reaction to design. The wealthy thinker often becomes architect of circumstances, preferring engineered outcomes over spontaneous unfolding. And in that architectural mindset lies both strength and subtle separation from earlier simplicity. Money does not merely expand life, it reorganizes thought, reshapes perception, and quietly redraws the boundaries of what feels necessary, tolerable, and meaningful.